What's up, everybody? Fred Minnick here, and today I am going to review one of the more highly anticipated early in the year releases, and that is the Woodford Reserve Batch Proof. Now, this little media sample was sent to me. It's 121.2 proof. This was released on February 7th, 2024. That was during my big game event, and I was pretty busy that week, I do recall. So this is a batch of 100 different Woodford Reserve barrels, and it has an SRP of, where is the SRP? $149.99. And it was mostly sold through the retail store at Woodford Reserve, but you can also find it in global markets, and I've seen it in like duty-free markets before. So it's still available out there, and it comes up on some of the auction sites like Unicorn Auctions, and occasionally a retailer will somehow have found it. Now, before I get into my tasting notes, I got some of that geeky history that you all love. But if you just want to skip that history, I will put the time code of when the tasting starts in the description, so you can click on that and go straight to there. So, Woodford Reserve is probably number one or number two of the most important whiskeys of the late 20th century. So when Woodford Reserve comes out in the mid-1990s, it is actually created to give Maker's Mark a competitive Kentucky bourbon, so it gets off the back of Jack Daniel's. So let me give you a little story here. This is chronicled in my book, Bourbon, the Rise, Fall, and Rebirth of American Whiskey. So Maker's Mark used to do everything that it could to torment Jack Daniel's. When I say torment, I mean Bill Samuels Jr. actually had a lot of fun of messing around with Owsley Brown, who was the late chairman of Brown-Forman, really an icon in American whiskey. And he would invite Owsley Brown over to his house for a Kentucky Derby party, and he would hire a band and call them the Jack Daniel's Band. Like, hey, everybody, meet the Jack Daniel's Band, and they would play music, and it would be a sanctioned Maker's Mark event. They actually hired someone in the South whose name was Jack Daniel, and they dressed him up like the Jack Daniels and put him in a Maker's Mark ad and said, hey, look, everybody, the Jack Daniels loves to drink Maker's Mark. And so you had Owsley Brown, who, Jack Daniels is an enormous brand, and Maker's Mark was then nowhere close to it. And today it's still nowhere close to it. Jack Daniels is enormous. Maker's Mark is big too, but Jack Daniels is a whole different level. So Owsley Brown gets his whole crew together, and he says, will someone please develop a bourbon and create it to get Maker's Mark off of Jack Daniel's back. And there was a couple angles as to why they chose what would become Woodford Reserve. One, they owned the facility. The LeBreau Graham Distillery was a part of their lineage. Brown-Forman had owned it and sold it, purchased it again as a part of their culture. And in bourbon, they tend to stay with things that are within their culture. So that was one thing. The other thing is Maker's Mark had actually developed a very prominent tourism world that would lead to the Kentucky Bourbon Trail. So the Maker's Mark tours in the 90s were really hot. They were like the only thing going. And so there was like a little curiosity of like, could there be something there to compete with Maker's Mark on a tourism side? And that was one of the big reasons why they chose the what is now the Woodford Reserve Distillery. It's beautiful. It's right in the middle of horse country. You have this incredible scenic drive to get there. Limestone cut walls, horse farms everywhere. And the old warehouses are just absolutely gorgeous. So it just kind of feels like a scene in the 1800s. And so Maker's Mark has a true competitor now. And Woodford Reserve just comes out of the gate, starts getting people all excited about it, and they become a very, very important part of the American whiskey scene. But I like to tell that story so people can understand a little bit of importance of like why Woodford Reserve came on so strong in the 90s and why Brown-Forman invested into a new brand instead of focusing on a brand like Old Forester or Early Times, which was important to them as well. Neither one of those brands had a sexy location like Woodford Reserve that could compete against Maker's Mark. So that's why Maker's Mark is probably the number one brand of the 20th century overall, but also the number one brand of the late 20th century, because not only were they pretty damn good at the time, they influenced the creation of Woodford Reserve. And you might ask yourself, where did I get that story? Well, it came from the president of Brown-Forman at the time of all that happening, and his name was Stephen Thompson. And Stephen passed away a couple years ago. He's in the Kentucky Bourbon Hall of Fame. Just a really, he was a really, really great dude. And that story has also been corroborated by a couple other people. So that's the story. And now for the tasting. For those of you who skipped the history portion, I highly recommend you go back and check it out. But I understand you just want to get to the tasting notes. I will say that Woodford Reserve's batch proof is consistently one of those products that people get really excited about. Last year, it finished number 7 in my top 100. So you're looking at, it was, the 900 something whiskeys I tasted last year, I deemed it to be the 7th best American whiskey of 2023. Where will this year's rank? The journey begins right now. Woo! Oh, man. Butterscotch. Vanilla. That smells like Kentucky. If I close my eyes and think about what Kentucky smells like, for me, it's sitting in the middle of a warehouse drawing whiskey straight from the barrel. This smells like a warehouse and a barrel tasting and the coolness of winter. You got snow outside. Oh, yeah, this smells fantastic. Oh, boy. All right, here I go. So first I want to tell you kind of how it's hitting my palate, where on my palate it's hitting. Everyone's tongue is different, and every taster is different. We're all unique in our own tasting prowess, right? But for me, I get this a little bit on the tip of the tongue, an enormous concentration in the middle of the palate, and a lot in the back. And just enough curls up underneath my tongue and kind of tickles my jawline a little bit to intrigue me to taste it again to see if those effects are there a second time. So here we go. Less concentrated on the sides of the jaw. Still curls up, but not as intense. The middle of the palate is still hugely powerful. Tip of the tongue, a little bit less so than the first taste. And then the back of the palate, pretty strong. So what flavors do I get out of this? Well, I'll tell you that butterscotch note that I smelled is here, but it's probably about the 5th or 6th note that I am detecting. The most prominent note that I'm getting is kind of like a vanilla icing, banana nut bread. So this is like a holiday bread that we would get. It's got that nice small coating of vanilla icing over the top of it. It's a banana bread, but it's got some walnuts in it. Take a bite of that, and there's 5 different flavors going on, it feels like, in some of those banana nut breads. But it has this beautiful vanilla icing banana nut bread note right there in the middle of it. After that, I get some some Indian type spices. So the spiciness I'm getting is not necessarily like a black pepper or a baking spice. I'd say it's more along the lines of like a curry. It's kind of like a curry or a cumin. They're not typical spices, but they're spicy, but they're definitely not your typical spices that I would get in American whiskey. And then I get a little bit of cherry. I get a little bit of orange, you know, maybe orange zest, but I feel like it's more of like an orange. And then I get that butterscotch note. So the butterscotch note is quite a bit ways down that list. And I'm telling you, if you're a banana nut bread fan, this will be your jam. I'd say I probably like last year's better. That cherry note's a little bit more prominent. But on that third taste, and it finishes pretty long with a hint of cherry. But I'd say I probably like last year's better, but it's not a fair comparison because I haven't put it in a blind yet. So I'd like to see where this one falls in a blind. This one I think would probably be more in the middle of the pack for me, unless I'm in the mood for a banana nut bread with a little icing on it, you know. But it's very tasty. I'd score this like a 91. I'd say this is better than than the Bookers I tasted this year. Better, you know. But I'd probably buy Old Forester 1920 over this. So that gives you some perspective. I'm also very high on Old Forester 1920. It's in the same family as Woodford Reserve, owned by Brown-Forman. So I think that's probably a pretty good comparison for you. Like if you really wanted to ascertain, I think it is worth the money and probably what would be the extra hunt in comparison to Old Forester 1920. Just my initial thought, no. I would buy Old Forester 1920 over this. That being said, I'll throw it in a blind tasting, and the blinds do not lie, so we'll see how it would finish in a blind. But that's going to do it for this little tasting episode. Thank you for tuning in. If you're not a subscriber yet, please become one. We'd love to have you over here on the channel. We're also dedicating a portion of the videos here to Forgotten Not Gone, which is a charity that helps raise money for suicide prevention. As an Iraq War veteran, I'm very passionate about helping out my fellow veterans. So be safe out there, and remember, vodka sucks unless it's being used to clean up the murder scene of a dead cat.